The encounter. The planet Virion was nothing like Captain Ethan Cross had seen before. Its sky shimmered with 3 suns, painting the horizon in hues of purple and gold. Towering alien trees loomed overhead, their bioluminescent leaves glowing faintly. Ethan adjusted the straps of his survival pack and checked his scanner for any signs of resources to repair his crashed ship. The readings were faint, but there was a flicker of hope nearby. As he made his way through the dense foliage, muffled sounds reached his ears, voices, grunts, and a low hum of machinery. Curious but cautious, Ethan crept toward the noise. The trees opened to reveal a massive alien settlement bustling with activity. Bright lights illuminated a large central market, crowded with beings of every shape and size. The air was thick with tension and the sharp smell of burning fuel. Ethan's gaze was drawn to a raised platform at the market center. There, a large alien with red, scaly skin barked commands in a harsh voice. Behind him, several cages held alien creatures of various species. Some looked defeated, sitting motionless, while others thrashed against their restraints in desperation. One cage stood out. Inside was a slender figure, barely recognizable as humanoid. She had silvery skin that shimmered under the lights, and her large violet eyes reflected a mix of fear and defiance. Despite the heavy chains around her wrists and ankles, her presence was magnetic. She glanced at the crowd, her gaze stopping on Ethan for a brief moment. Ethan froze. It was as if she were speaking directly to him, but her lips didn't move. A faint voice echoed in his mind. "Help me." He blinked, unsure if he was imagining things. He'd heard stories about telepathic species, but he'd never encountered one. The thought of leaving her there gnawed at him, but interfering meant risking his life. Ethan wasn't a hero. He was just a pilot trying to survive. "Sold." To the buyer in the black cloak, the auctioneer roared, jolting Ethan from his thoughts. A tall, shadowy figure stepped forward, his hood obscuring his face. The crowd parted as he approached the cage, his very presence radiating menace. The girl shrank back, her earlier defiance replaced by visible terror. Ethan clenched his fists. Something about the hooded figure felt wrong, predatory. The girl's silent plea replayed in his mind. He couldn't walk away now. Ethan stepped closer to the stage, keeping to the shadows. His mind raced. He didn't have weapons or enough credits to outbid the mysterious buyer. What he did have, however, was a knack for improvisation. He scanned the area, noting the guards' positions and the layout of the cages. The crowd began to disperse as the hooded buyer motioned to the guards to load the girl into a transport. Ethan moved swiftly, slipping behind a row of supply crates. He pulled out a small EMP device from his pack, a tool meant for disabling electronics during emergencies. It wasn't much, but it might buy him time. The transport's engine roared to life, and the guards began unlocking the girl's cage. She struggled as they dragged her out, her chains clinking loudly against the metal floor. The hooded buyer watched in silence, his face still hidden. Ethan activated the EMP, tossing it toward the transport. It landed under the vehicle with a soft thunk. A burst of energy rippled through the air, and the transport sputtered to a halt. The lights around the market flickered, plunging the area into momentary chaos. Shouts erupted as the guards scrambled to restore order. Ethan took his chance. He darted forward, using the commotion as cover. Reaching the girl, he pulled a small cutting tool from his belt and began slicing through her chains. "What are you doing?" she asked aloud, her voice soft but urgent. Her violet eyes widened in surprise as she realized he was helping her. "Getting you out of here," Ethan replied, his voice steadied despite his racing heart. The chains fell away, and Ethan grabbed her arm. "Run," he ordered. The two bolted toward the edge of the market, weaving through the panicked crowd. Behind them, the hooded buyer shouted commands, his deep voice cutting through the chaos. Guards pursued them, their heavy boots pounding against the ground. Ethan and the girl reached the outskirts of the market, where the dense jungle awaited. "Can you keep up?" he asked, glancing back at her. "I'll manage," she replied, her voice determined despite her earlier fear. Blaster fire erupted behind them, singing the air. Ethan ducked, pulling the girl down with him. "This way," he shouted, leading her into the thick underbrush. The jungle swallowed them whole, its shadows offering a fragile sense of safety. They ran until their legs burned and their breaths came in ragged gasps. Finally, they stopped near a cluster of glowing plants. Ethan leaned against a tree, clutching his side. The girl sat beside him, her chains still dangling from her wrists. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice filled with equal parts curiosity and gratitude. Ethan stared at her, his expression unreadable. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I couldn't just stand there and do nothing." She nodded, her violet eyes softening. "Thank you." Before Ethan could respond, a distant howl echoed through the jungle. The sound was unnatural, a chilling reminder that their troubles were far from over. "We need to keep moving," Ethan said, pushing himself upright. The girl stood as well, her chains clinking softly. "My name is Lyra," she said. "Ethan," he replied. "Let's get out of here, Lyra." And with that, they vanished into the jungle, the night swallowing them as their uncertain journey began. The escape. The jungle around them was alive with alien sounds. Strange creatures chirped, growled, and howled, hidden in the shadows of towering trees that glowed faintly in the dark. Ethan and Lyra didn't have time to appreciate the eerie beauty. They were being hunted. Ethan crouched low, his hand gripping the cool, metallic edge of a survival knife. Beside him, Lyra clung to her tattered cloak, her silvery skin catching the faint light. Her violet eyes darted nervously. Behind them, the shouts of the guards grew louder, punctuated by the whirring of hover drones scanning the forest. "We don't have much time," Ethan whispered. He pointed toward a thicket of vines ahead. "Through there, it might slow them down." Lyra nodded but hesitated. Her voice entered his mind again, soft and uncertain. "They'll find us. They always do." Ethan glanced at her, unsettled by the way her thoughts slipped into his head. "Not if we outsmart them," he said aloud. "Stay close." They pushed through the vines, the thick foliage tugging at their clothes and scratching their skin. Lyra stumbled, weakened by the chains still dangling from her wrists and ankles. Ethan stopped, cutting through the remaining links with his blade. "Can you move better now?" he asked, his voice steady despite his growing frustration. "Yes," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Ethan turned back toward the path they'd come from. A faint orange glow appeared in the distance. The guards were using heat scanners now. His mind raced. He had no weapons strong enough to take on the heavily armed patrol, and their drones were far too fast to outrun. An idea struck him. He grabbed Lyra's arm. "Do you trust me?" She blinked, confused. "I don't even know you." "Fair enough," Ethan said with a wry grin. "But trust me anyway." Before she could argue, he began digging through his survival pack. He pulled out a small cylindrical device and placed it in the mud. "Decoy beacon," he explained. "It's going to emit our heat signatures for a few minutes. If we're lucky, they'll chase it instead of us." Lyra frowned, her voice slipping into his mind again. "And if we're unlucky? They'll shoot it and realize we're not there. Then they'll kill us," Ethan said with a shrug. "But I prefer to think positive." The beacon emitted a faint hum as it activated, and the glow behind them seemed to shift. The guards' shouts moved away, growing fainter as they chased the decoy deeper into the jungle. Ethan exhaled sharply. "Let's go." They moved quickly but quietly, their steps muffled by the damp forest floor. Every few moments, Ethan glanced back to make sure they weren't being followed. Lyra kept pace, though she seemed uneasy. Her eyes darted to the shadows, and her breaths came in short, uneven bursts. "You okay?" Ethan asked after a while. "I can feel them," she whispered. "Their minds are close. Angry. Desperate." Ethan frowned. "Can you tell where they are?" She closed her eyes, her face tightening in concentration. A moment later, her eyes snapped open. They split up. Two are coming this way. One is looping around to cut us off. Great, Ethan muttered. Can you do anything to? I don't know. Confuse them. Make them think we went another way. Lyra shook her head. It doesn't work like that. I can't control minds. I can only hear them. Guess we'll have to do this the hard way, Ethan said, scanning their surroundings. His eyes landed on a fallen log covered in glowing moss. It wasn't much, but it would do. Hide under there, he told Lyra, pointing to the log. What about you? She asked, her voice trembling. I'll distract them, Ethan said. He pulled out a flare gun from his pack and loaded a round. Once I get their attention, you run as fast as you can. Head for that ridge we saw earlier. Got it? Lyra hesitated, her telepathic voice brushing against his thoughts. You'll die. Not if I'm faster than they are, Ethan replied with a smirk. Now go. Reluctantly, Lyra crawled under the log, her silver skin blending with the moss. Ethan took a deep breath and stepped into a clearing, raising the flare gun high. With a loud pop, the flare shot into the sky, its red light cutting through the darkness. The jungle erupted in noise. The guards shouted, their footsteps thundering as they closed in on the clearing. Ethan sprinted in the opposite direction, weaving between trees and leaping over roots. Blaster fire scorched the air around him, close enough to make him sweat. He dove behind a boulder, heart pounding. The guards were getting closer. He could hear the mechanical whir of a drone hovering nearby. Then, out of nowhere, a guard appeared, his weapon raised. Ethan tensed, ready to fight, but before the alien could fire, he froze. His expression twisted into confusion, then fear, as if he were staring at something terrifying. Ethan glanced behind him. Lyra stood there, her violet eyes glowing faintly. The guard dropped his weapon and stumbled back, clutching his head as if in pain. Run, Lyra shouted aloud, her voice breaking the spell. Ethan didn't need to be told twice. Together, they vanished into the jungle, the guard's shouts fading behind them. For the first time, Ethan realized just how dangerous Lyra might be, and how much he needed her to survive. A fragile alliance. The fire crackled softly, casting long shadows against the jagged walls of the shallow cave Ethan had chosen as their shelter. Outside, the alien jungle pulsed with life, its eerie sounds a constant reminder of how far they were from safety. Ethan leaned against the rough stone, a makeshift bandage wrapped tightly around his forearm. The blaster burn still stung, but it wasn't the worst injury he'd faced. Across the fire, Lyra sat silently, her knees drawn to her chest. Her silver skin shimmered faintly in the dim light, but her violet eyes were dull, distant. She hadn't spoken since they escaped the patrol hours ago, and the silence was beginning to feel heavier than the jungle's oppressive heat. You've got a lot of guts for someone so quiet, Ethan finally said, his voice breaking the stillness. He poked at the fire with a stick, watching the embers swirl. That thing you did back there, with the guard, what was that? Lyra didn't look up. For a moment, Ethan thought she wouldn't answer. Then her voice brushed against his mind, soft and hesitant. I didn't want to hurt him. I had no choice. Ethan frowned. He still wasn't used to the way her words bypassed his ears and went straight into his head. Seemed pretty effective. You didn't kill them. At least. She finally raised her eyes to meet his. It's not a weapon, she said aloud, her voice as soft as her thoughts. It's a part of me. My curse. Curse? Ethan asked, leaning forward. You call saving our lives a curse? You don't understand, Lyra said, her voice tightening. When I reach into someone's mind, I don't just confuse them. I see everything. Their thoughts, their fears, their pain. It's overwhelming. It's why they wanted me. Ethan's gaze softened. He leaned back, letting her words sink in. He didn't know what it felt like to carry that kind of burden, but he could see the weight of it in her eyes. Well, he said after a moment, I'm glad you used it. If you hadn't, we'd both be dead. Lyra didn't respond. She pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders, as if trying to shield herself from his words. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, I get it. You've been through hell. But if we're going to survive, we have to trust each other. That means no more secrets. Lyra's eyes flashed. Trust, she said sharply. You don't trust me. You're afraid of me. Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but stopped. Was she wrong? That moment in the jungle, when she had stared down the guard and made him collapse, had sent a shiver down his spine. What else was she capable of? I'm not afraid of you, he said finally. I just don't understand you yet. Lyra stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she nodded. I don't understand you either. Humans, you risk your life for me. A stranger. Why? Ethan hesitated. He didn't have a simple answer. He'd asked himself the same question ever since he cut her chains. Maybe I saw something in you, he said. Something worth saving. Lyra tilted her head, her violet eyes narrowing. Or maybe you felt guilty. You couldn't stand to walk away. Ethan smirked. You're good at this mind-reading thing, huh? Her lips twitched into the faintest smile, the first he'd seen from her. But it vanished just as quickly. She glanced toward the cave entrance, her expression darkening. They're still looking for us, she murmured. Ethan's muscles tensed. How close? Far enough for now, she said. But they won't stop. Not until they have me. Ethan cursed under his breath. He glanced at his damaged scanner, then at Lyra. If we keep moving, we might make it to the ridge by morning. There's a chance we can get a signal out, call for help. Lyra shook her head. No signal will reach this planet. It's shielded. They don't want anyone coming here. Ethan's jaw tightened. Then we'll have to find another way. Silence fell between them again, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Lyra's gaze dropped to the ground. I'm sorry, she said quietly. Ethan blinked. For what? For dragging you into this, she said. For putting your life at risk. Ethan chuckled, surprising her. Lady, my life was already a mess before you came along. Crashing on this rock just sped things up. Besides, he added, his tone softening, you didn't ask to be here either. Lyra looked at him, her violet eyes shimmering with something he couldn't quite place. Gratitude, maybe, or guilt. She opened her mouth to speak but froze, her head snapping toward the cave entrance. They're here, she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan didn't need to ask how she knew. He grabbed his pack and extinguished the fire with his boot. Stay close, he said, his voice low. And whatever happens, don't stop running. Lyra nodded, her face pale but determined. Together, they slipped into the shadows of the jungle, the faint glow of alien searchlights cutting through the trees behind them. The fragile trust between them would be tested soon enough. The trackers' hunt. The jungle was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that warned of a predator nearby. Ethan crouched low, his eyes scanning the dense foliage ahead. The air was heavy with moisture, and every breath felt like a struggle. Beside him, Lyra was unnaturally still, her violet eyes unfocused as if she were listening to something Ethan couldn't hear. They're close, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan's grip tightened on the makeshift spear he'd carved from a sturdy branch. How close? Lyra's gaze snapped to him. Not they. Him. Ethan frowned. Just one. She nodded, her silver skin catching the faint bioluminescent glow of the jungle's alien plants. He's different. His thoughts are sharper, calculated. He's not like the others. Great, Ethan muttered. As if the regular ones weren't bad enough. A faint rustling sound came from somewhere to their left. Ethan froze, his muscles tensing as he scanned the trees. The sound stopped, leaving the jungle silent again. Too silent. Move, Lyra whispered suddenly, grabbing his arm. Ethan didn't argue. They darted through the thick underbrush, the the ground soft and spongy beneath their boots. Every step felt like a gamble. The tracker could be anywhere, watching, waiting. "How do you know he's not like the others?" Ethan asked as they ran. Lyra hesitated before answering, her voice slipping into his mind instead of his ears. "Because he's hunting you, not me." Ethan stumbled, her words hitting him harder than he expected. "What? Why?" "He sees you as a threat," she said aloud this time, her tone grim. "The others were after me because of what I can do. But him, he wants to eliminate you first." Ethan didn't have time to process that revelation. A faint whirring sound reached his ears, growing louder with each passing second. He glanced over his shoulder and spotted a sleek, insect-like drone weaving through the trees behind them. "Drone," he hissed. Lyra glanced back, her eyes widening. "It's marking us. The tracker will know exactly where we are." "Not for long," Ethan said, veering off the path and pulling Lyra with him. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small EMP grenade. He only had one left, and he hoped it would be enough. "Keep running," he shouted, tossing the grenade behind them. The device detonated with a sharp crack, and the drone sputtered midair before crashing into the underbrush. The explosion sent a flock of alien birds screeching into the sky, their glowing feathers scattering like embers in the darkness. "That'll buy us some time," Ethan said, breathing hard. "But not much." Lyra stopped abruptly, her hand gripping Ethan's arm. Her eyes widened with fear. "He's here." Ethan turned slowly, his heart pounding. The jungle felt alive with tension, every shadow a potential threat. Then he saw him. The tracker stepped into view, his tall, armored figure blending almost seamlessly with the surrounding jungle. His helmet had a sleek insectoid design, with glowing green lenses that gave him an almost alien appearance. In his hands was a weapon Ethan didn't recognize, its barrel humming faintly with energy. "Well, you've certainly made this interesting," the tracker said, his voice distorted through his helmet. "But the game ends here." Ethan raised his spear, though he knew it was a futile gesture. "I don't suppose you'd consider letting us go." The tracker tilted his head, amused. "You're clever, human. I'll give you that. But you've made one mistake." "Yeah. What's that?" The tracker's weapon hummed louder, its energy building. "You underestimated me." Before Ethan could react, the tracker fired. A bright, crackling net shot toward them, its edges glowing with deadly energy. Ethan pushed Lyra aside and dove to the ground, barely avoiding the trap. The net struck a tree behind them, disintegrating its trunk in an instant. "Run," Ethan shouted to Lyra. She hesitated, her violet eyes locking onto his. "Not without you." "Just go," he barked, gripping his spear tightly. Lyra's lips pressed into a thin line, but she turned and disappeared into the jungle. The tracker didn't seem to care. His focus was entirely on Ethan. "You're brave," the tracker said, stepping closer. "But bravery won't save you." Ethan smirked, despite the fear clawing at his chest. "Funny. I was about to say the same thing to you." He hurled the spear with all his strength. The tracker dodged it effortlessly, but the distraction was enough. Ethan grabbed a sharp rock from the ground and lunged at the tracker, aiming for his weapon. The tracker blocked the attack, slamming Ethan to the ground with surprising force. Pain shot through Ethan's ribs as he struggled to get up. "You're out of tricks," the tracker said, raising his weapon for the final blow. Before he could fire, the air around them seemed to shimmer. The tracker staggered, his weapon lowering as he clutched his helmet. What are you?" he stammered, his voice filled with confusion. Ethan turned to see Lyra standing a few feet away, her eyes glowing brighter than he'd ever seen. She raised her hand, and the tracker dropped to his knees, his weapon falling from his grip. "Run," she shouted, her voice trained. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed her arm and pulled her away, leaving the tracker writhing in the dirt. They didn't stop running until the jungle swallowed them completely. When they finally collapsed near a stream, Ethan turned to Lyra, his chest heaving. "What did you do to him?" Lyra's hands trembled as she wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead. "I made him see himself." Ethan stared at her, his mind racing. Whatever Lyra had just done, it was far more dangerous than he realized. And so was she. Trust tested. The rain fell in a steady, unrelenting sheet, drenching the jungle and masking their footsteps. Ethan and Lyra trudged through the undergrowth, their movements slowed by exhaustion. Water dripped from the leaves above, and the distant rumble of thunder echoed through the alien sky. But even the storm couldn't drown out the tension between them. Ethan stole a glance at Lyra as they walked. Her silvery skin was dulled by mud, and her violet eyes flickered with unease. She hadn't spoken since they'd escaped the tracker, and that silence gnawed at him. He didn't know whether it was guilt, fear, or something else entirely. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. "Are you going to tell me what happened back there?" he asked, his voice cutting through the rain. Lyra stopped, turning to face him. Her gaze was sharp, almost defiant. "What do you mean?" Ethan threw up his hands. "Don't play coy. You took down that tracker without laying a finger on him. You made him, I don't know, break. What did you do to him?" Lyra's jaw tightened. "I showed him the truth." "What truth?" Ethan pressed. "Because whatever it was, it looked like it nearly killed him. And you." Lyra hesitated, her eyes searching his face for something. Trust, perhaps. But whatever she was looking for, she didn't seem to find it. "You wouldn't understand," she said finally, turning away. Ethan stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "Try me." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The rain poured around them, and the jungle seemed to hold its breath. Then Lyra sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I reached into his mind," she said, her voice barely audible. "I showed him his memories, his actions, his fears, everything he hides from the world. And himself. I forced him to confront it all at once." Ethan stared at her, his stomach twisting. "That's intense." "It's not something I do lightly," Lyra continued, her tone bitter. "But he left me no choice. He would have killed you." Ethan nodded slowly, his mind racing. "You said you don't control minds. But what you did, sounds an awful lot like control to me." Lyra flinched as if he'd struck her. "I don't control them," she said sharply. "I open the door. What they see is their own doing." "Still feels like crossing a line," Ethan said, his voice soft but firm. "How do I know you haven't done that to me?" Lyra's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, Ethan thought she might lash out. Instead, she took a step back, her expression wounded. "You think I would invade your mind? After everything?" "I don't know what to think," Ethan admitted. "But you've got powers I don't understand, and you're not exactly forthcoming about them." Lyra's lips pressed into a thin line. "Do you think I wanted this?" she snapped. "To be hunted, feared, hated for something I never asked for." Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but she didn't let him. "I didn't choose to be this way," she continued, her voice trembling. "But if you can't trust me, then maybe you should have left me in that cage." Her words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He looked away, the rain soaking his face as guilt settled in his chest. "That's not what I meant," he said quietly. I don't want any more surprises." Lyra took a deep breath, calming herself. "Neither do I. But if we're going to survive, you need to stop doubting me." Ethan nodded reluctantly. "Fair enough." They continued walking in silence, the tension between them still heavy. But as they reached the edge of a clearing, Lyra suddenly stopped, her eyes narrowing. "What is it?" Ethan asked. "There's something ahead," she said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "I can't tell if it's a threat or not." Ethan peered into the clearing. At first he saw nothing but the rain-soaked jungle. Then he spotted it, a small, flickering light, barely visible through the mist. It seemed to come from an old alien structure, half buried in vines and moss. "Looks like shelter," Ethan said cautiously. But if you've got a bad feeling, we can keep moving. Lyra hesitated, then shook her head. We need to rest. And we need answers. Maybe there's something in there that can help us. Together, they approached the structure, their movements careful and deliberate. The air around it felt colder, heavier, as if the building itself carried a sense of foreboding. Ethan pushed the rusted door open, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife at his belt. Inside, the room was dimly lit by faintly glowing alien symbols etched into the walls. Strange machines, long dormant, lined the edges of the space. Lyra stepped forward, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and recognition. What is this place? Ethan asked. It's ancient, Lyra murmured. Older than anything I've ever seen. But it feels familiar. Ethan frowned. Familiar how? Before she could answer, a low hum filled the air. The symbols on the walls glowed brighter, and one of the machines sputtered to life. Ethan and Lyra exchanged a wary glance. Well, Ethan said, gripping his knife tightly. So much for no more surprises. The ancient ruins. The air inside the ancient structure was cold and unnervingly still. Dim, pulsating light seeped from alien symbols carved into the walls, casting eerie shadows across the chamber. Ethan stepped cautiously, his boots crunching on a metallic floor that felt as if it hadn't been disturbed in centuries. Beside him, Lyra moved with a quiet reverence, her violet eyes scanning the strange glyphs. You know what this place is, don't you? Ethan asked, his voice low. It felt wrong to speak too loudly, as if the ruin itself were listening. Lyra hesitated, brushing her fingers against the glowing wall. Not exactly, she murmured. But I can feel it. This place was built by my ancestors, or beings like them. Ethan frowned. So, what? This is some kind of temple. Maybe, Lyra said, her tone distant. Or a vault. A sanctuary. I don't know yet. A sudden mechanical groan echoed through the chamber, making Ethan flinch. He drew his knife instinctively, scanning the shadows. Yeah, well, let's hope it's not a tomb. Lyra gave him a faint smile, but didn't respond. Her attention was drawn to a raised platform at the center of the room. A complex machine stood there, its design both alien and oddly organic. Wires and tubes stretched across its surface like veins, and a faint blue light pulsed at its core. This is it, Lyra whispered, stepping closer. Ethan followed, his unease growing. This is what? The answer, Lyra said, her voice filled with awe. If we can power this machine, it might be able to help us. It could disable the tracker's signal, maybe even send a distress call off-world. Ethan inspected the machine, his skepticism clear. And what happens if it's rigged to blow us to pieces instead? Lyra shook her head. It's not a weapon. I can feel its purpose. It's connected to me, somehow. Ethan's brow furrowed. Okay, let's assume you're right. How do we power it? This thing looks ancient. Lyra stepped closer to the machine, her hand hovering over its glowing core. It needs an energy source, something strong enough to activate its systems. She looked at Ethan, her expression serious. I can do it. Ethan's stomach tightened. Do what exactly? I can transfer my energy into it, Lyra explained. My abilities, my connection to the ruins, it's compatible. I can feel it. Ethan shook his head. Absolutely not. You barely survived using your powers on the tracker. This could kill you. Lyra's gaze hardened. If we don't try, we'll die anyway. The tracker will find us. And this time, we won't escape. That's not a good enough reason to risk your life, Ethan argued. We can find another way. Lyra stepped closer to him, her voice soft but firm. You don't understand. I've spent my whole life running, hiding, being used by people who saw me as nothing more than a tool. This is my chance to fight back, to make my abilities mean something. Ethan stared at her, torn. He admired her resolve, But the thought of losing her after everything they'd been through made his chest ache. And what happens if you're wrong? If this thing drains you completely? Lyra smiled faintly. Then at least I'll know I tried. Before Ethan could stop her, she placed her hands on the machine. The blue light flared to life, and a low hum filled the chamber. Lyra's body tensed as energy coursed through her silvery skin glowing faintly. "Lyra!" Ethan shouted, stepping forward, but an invisible force pushed him back. The machine's light grew brighter, and the symbols on the walls began to shift and move, as if coming alive. Lyra's eyes snapped open, glowing with the same blue light. Her voice echoed in Ethan's mind, layered with a strange, otherworldly tone. "It's working. I can feel the connection, but it's taking more than I expected." "Then stop," Ethan yelled. "We'll find another way." "I can't," she replied. "It's too late." The machine shuddered, and a beam of light shot upward, piercing the ceiling and vanishing into the sky. The ground trembled, and Ethan struggled to keep his balance. He watched helplessly as Lyra's body began to sway, her strength fading. "Lyra, listen to me," Ethan shouted. "You don't have to do this alone. Let me help." "You can't," she whispered, her voice faltering. "But you can finish what I started. There's a console, over there. It'll direct the signal." Ethan hesitated, then sprinted to the console she'd indicated. Its interface was incomprehensible, a swirling mass of alien symbols. "I don't even know what I'm looking at," he yelled. "Trust yourself," Lyra's voice said faintly. "You'll know." Ethan gritted his teeth, his fingers hovering over the controls. He didn't understand how, but as he stared at the symbols, their meaning began to take shape in his mind. It was as if Lyra's presence was guiding him. He pressed a sequence of symbols, and the beam of light intensified. A deep, resonant tone filled the air, and the trembling stopped. The machine's light dimmed, and Lyra collapsed to the floor. Ethan was at her side in an instant, his heart pounding. "Lyra, stay with me." Her eyes fluttered open, weak but alive. "Did it work?" she whispered. Ethan glanced at the machine, its glow now soft and steady. "Yeah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You did it." Lyra managed a faint smile before closing her eyes, her breathing shallow but steady. Ethan held her close, his grip firm as he whispered, "You're not going anywhere." "Not yet." Above them, the beam of light continued to shine, a silent signal of hope cutting through the darkness. "Freedom or sacrifice?" The signal beam stretched into the alien sky, piercing through the clouds like a cosmic beacon. The ancient ruin hummed with quiet power, its glowing symbols pulsing in rhythm with Lyra's faint breaths. Ethan crouched beside her, one arm supporting her limp body while his other hand hovered protectively over the pistol he'd scavenged from one of the fallen guards. Her silvery skin was dull, her violet eyes half closed as she struggled to stay conscious. "Stay with me, Lyra," Ethan urged, his voice cracking. "We're almost there." Before she could respond, a deep, mechanical roar echoed through the jungle. The air seemed to thicken with menace, and the ground trembled under the weight of approaching footsteps. Ethan's stomach sank as the shadows at the edge of the ruin shifted, giving way to a towering figure. The Overlord. He was larger than any of the guards, his scaled armor gleaming under the glow of the ruins. A cruel grin spread across his reptilian face as his glowing eyes locked onto Ethan and Lyra. "Well, well," the Overlord rumbled, his voice dripping with mockery. "The human and the little runaway. I must admit, I didn't expect you to make it this far." Ethan rose to his feet, placing himself between Lyra and the Overlord. "Turn around and leave," he said, his voice steady despite the odds. "You're not taking her." The Overlord laughed, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down Ethan's spine. "Bold words, human, but bravery won't save you. Surrender her now, and I might let you live." Ethan tightened his grip on the pistol. "Not happening." The Overlord's grin widened, revealing sharp predatory teeth. "Then you'll die like the others." Before Ethan could react, the Overlord charged, moving faster than his massive frame should allow. Ethan fired, the shot glancing off the Overlord's armor with a harmless spark. The pistol was useless. Ethan dove to the side as the Overlord's massive clawed hand slammed into the ground where he'd stood, sending a shockwave through the chamber. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing a jagged piece of debris as a makeshift weapon. Ethan. Lyra's weak voice echoed in his mind, pulling his attention. "Not now," he shouted, ducking another swipe from the Overlord. "Listen to me," her voice insisted. "The machine, it's still connected to me. I can stop him." Ethan glanced at her, his heart sinking. "No way. You're barely holding on. You do that, and it'll kill you." "If you don't let me, he'll kill us both," she said, her tone resolute. "And he'll keep enslaving others." The Overlord roared, slamming a clawed fist into one of the ruin's pillars. The ancient structure groaned, dust and debris raining down from above. Ethan knew Lyra was right. They were out of time. "Fine," he growled, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm buying you as much time as I can." Ethan charged the Overlord, his makeshift weapon aimed at the vulnerable joints in the armor. He struck with everything he had, aiming for speed over power. The Overlord snarled, swatting at him like an insect, but Ethan danced just out of reach. Meanwhile, Lyra crawled toward the machine, her hands trembling as she placed them on its glowing surface. The symbols on the walls flared to life, and a resonant hum filled the chamber. The Overlord paused, his eyes narrowing as he sensed the shift in energy. "What are you doing, girl?" he growled, turning toward Lyra. "Hey!" Ethan shouted, throwing a chunk of debris at the Overlord's head. It bounced off harmlessly, but the distraction worked. The Overlord turned his rage back on Ethan. Lyra's body tensed as the machine drew energy from her, her silver skin glowing faintly. Her voice entered Ethan's mind, strained but determined. "It's working. Keep him distracted a little longer." Ethan ducked another attack, the air around him vibrating from the sheer force of the Overlord's swings. His muscles screamed in protest, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. The ruined symbols burned brighter, and the hum grew into a deafening crescendo. The Overlord froze, his eyes darting around as the chamber began to quake. "No," he roared, lunging toward Lyra. Ethan threw himself in the way, tackling the Overlord with every ounce of strength he had. The impact sent them both crashing to the ground. The machine's core flared, and a shockwave of light exploded outward, engulfing the chamber. The Overlord screamed, his voice drowned out by the roar of energy. Ethan shielded his eyes, the force of the blast throwing him back. When the light faded, the chamber was silent. The Overlord lay motionless, his armor cracked and lifeless. The ruins were dark, the symbols extinguished. Ethan crawled toward Lyra, his heart pounding. She lay slumped beside the machine, her body still. "Lyra," he cried, shaking her gently. Her eyes fluttered open, dim but alive. Did it work?" she whispered. Ethan nodded, tears of relief streaming down his face. "Yeah, it worked. He's gone." She managed a faint smile before her eyes closed again, her breathing shallow but steady. Ethan scooped her into his arms, holding her close. Above them, the ruins emitted a final pulse of light, and Ethan heard the faint crackle of a signal, a distress beacon cutting through the void. Help was on the way. But for Ethan, the real victory was holding onto the fragile bond he'd found in the most unlikely of places. And as the jungle grew quiet once more, he vowed to protect Lyra at all costs, no matter what challenges lay ahead.